All right, so getting started, I'm Amanda Ahrens, the Fair Housing Officer for the City of Albany. And today I am doing a presentation to provide you information on the basics of living with mental health conditions and disabilities within housing. I do want to say that um, this is not legal advice. I'm just providing you information. And we'll try to save any questions for the end. It is a small group though, so we may be able to ask some as we go. For the people online, just put it in the chat. And for the people in person, we'll try to answer them as we can. All right, and so what you're gonna learn today is the basics of fair housing. We'll briefly cover that just to have a starting foundation. And then we'll see how what's considered a disability under the Fair Housing Act and what are possible barriers to housing. And then we'll go over requesting reasonable accommodations and modifications, what proof is needed for that, can you be charged a fee, and can your request be denied and for what reasons? And then we'll do a little pop quiz. After that, we will do assistance in service animals. We'll cover what's allowed and what's not. What do you need to know for requesting that? And then we'll do briefly the next three topics, which is source of income discrimination as it relates to disability, parking accommodations, accessible design and construction. And then we will cover the most common issues you may experience while finding a home, and then how you can contact the Fair Housing Office and how I can help. All right, so again, to start off, what is fair housing? Fair housing refers to the federal, state, and local laws that protect certain groups of people from being treated unequally in housing-related activities, which, as we know, is also called housing discrimination. And you can see the federal, state, and local laws here that provide protections. And it's important to know where to find this information so that you are protected. So who must comply with fair housing laws? It's anybody who is a landlord, owns property for housing purposes, mortgage lenders, leasing agents, management companies, insurance providers, homeless shelters, municipal services like trash, electric, water, and housing organizations providing assistance. So to put it in context, let's say you go to rent an apartment and anybody who owns the building, the maintenance staff, the management companies, anybody who comes in to fix the electric, they should all be held accountable and comply with fair housing laws. The types of housing that is covered is going to vary depending on the protections, but in a general, New York State, almost all types of housing are covered under fair housing, which includes also apartments, assisted living, transitional housing, and homeless shelters used as a residence. There are a few exceptions, such as 2 or 1 family buildings that are owner occupied, rooming rentals for same-sex individuals, and religious organizations or member-only private clubs, such as housing exclusive for 55 years old of age. So who is covered under fair housing? Today, again, we'll go over a little bit of disability, lawful source of income, and I do want to point out arrest record as it relates to another protected class. So that could be a disability. So if you were to have a arrest record for something related to your disability and you were denied housing for that, you may have a claim for housing discrimination. But it also covers race, color, sex, which also is sexual orientation and gender, and national origin, religion, and familial status, which is anybody caring for a child under the age of 18. And that's all covered under federal. And then New York State and city also has additional protections for people of 18 years older, immigration and citizenship status, their lawful source of income, as we discussed, marital or domestic partnership, and military status. So this is where we get into the nitty-gritty of today's lessons. So what is a disability according to fair housing laws? It is defined as an individual with a physical or mental impairment that it substantially limits one or more of their major life activities. It could also be somebody with a record or a history of such impairment, or somebody who is regarded or perceived as having such an impairment. And to further the definition, a major life activity would include daily activities such as walking, speaking, hearing, seeing, breathing, working, learning, performing manual tasks, and even caring for themselves. I do want to say that also covers not only the person who is renting the apartment, but anybody else living in there as well, such as children with disabilities. And as you'll see, living with physical disabilities, here are just a few that are some of the common ones. And barriers to housing may look like needing an extra room for medical equipment, having difficulties accessing the building, such as doors, locks, needing different signage, or having a difficulty getting up and down the stairs. They need written communication or interpretation services, or they may need a live-in aid or have an emotional or support service animal. For somebody living with mental health conditions, intellectual or developmental disabilities, that may include emotional, psychological, or social well-being, and it affects how we think, feel, and act. And it also determines how we handle stress, relate to others, and what choices we make. So you'll see just a few examples here. And barriers to housing, depending on the mental health condition, could be, again, as we talked about, difficulties caring for yourself um, or caring for your property. It could look like hoarding, having difficulty filling out paperwork, or having time blindness. So you need somebody to help you along with that. Social isolation, not trusting others in your home. So you need a family member there if maintenance staff comes, or needing an emotional support animal. And I do want to make sure that we're highlighting that language matters and how we talk about people with mental illness, because it further stigmatizes people when we say certain things and how we talk about them. So we want to avoid terms such as mentally disabled or handicapped, mentally ill. We don't want to say that they're crazy, insane, nuts, psycho. Those are all things that we should try to avoid out of our daily vocabularies. Instead, we should refer to somebody as a person who is living with a mental health condition. And of course, mental health conditions often go unseen, so we want to make sure that we're validating that as much as we validate other disabilities that are physical. All right, so moving on to requesting reasonable accommodations and modifications. What are reasonable accommodations under the Fair Housing Act? It addresses certain rules, policies, procedures, and services. And these adjustments are the responsibility of the housing provider. So that could look like allowing a service animal despite a no pet policy, giving a tenant with a disability a reserved parking space, allowing the tenant to have a live-in aid, as we mentioned, allowing a tenant with a disability to move from one unit to another and not charging them to do so. Changing the rent due date because of the disability income that they receive. The staff will take like garbage or grab the mail for the person because of their limited mobility, or having leniency for behavior that typically violates the lease. And this is something that I can help you with. I've helped people draft and submit accommodation requests to their housing providers. Moving on to reasonable modifications, which is a structural change that allows someone with a disability to safely and freely enjoy the use of their home. These modifications, however, are the responsibility of the person with the disability. And if they do make a modification, the housing provider can request that the work be done by a professional and ensure that there's permits. So let's say that a housing provider lets somebody with a disability install grab bars, But in order to do that, they have to install studs in the walls first. Again, we have to make sure it's done by a professional if that's what the housing provider wants and that there's permits along with that. When the tenant moves out, the landlord or the housing provider can have them return it to its original condition, which would mean just uninstalling the grab bar. It wouldn't mean taking out those studs. And again, some examples of that would be widening doorways, the grab bars in the bathrooms, as I had just talked about, installing a ramp, lowering the height of cabinets, installing an automatic faucet shut-off, installing a chair lift, replacing an audio doorbell with a light-up doorbell. And when we're talking about requesting these reasonable modifications or accommodations, we have to consider what is reasonable. So that would be changes that do not impose an undue financial or administrative burden, and that would not fundamentally alter or change the housing provider's operations in any way. So this could be actions that would require substantial modifications to or eliminate the essential lease or program requirements of the housing provider, and actions that would require the owner to provide supportive services such as counseling or medical services that are outside of the housing provider's scope. The other thing would be actions that require the owner to offer housing of a fundamentally different nature than the type of housing that they already offer. Things to consider when deciding whether it's reasonable or not is the cost of the modification, what's the benefit to the person requesting it, what are the resources of the housing provider, and if there's any more alternatives that could be better suited to this. And who can request a reasonable accommodation or modification? That is anybody or anyone on behalf of somebody living in the household with a disability, and they can request that at any time. The request does not have to be a specific form. However, it should include the person has a disability that is defined under the Fair Housing Act. It should make sure it says that. And it should state that the requested accommodation or modification is necessary because of the disability to fully use and enjoy their home. Federal. Most of these are federal. Under the Fair Housing Act, which is federal. Yep. They were just, the person in the audience was just asking what most of this is covered under. And I said, most of these are federal. Do I need to provide documentation to verify my disability? That's a good question. So a housing provider can certainly ask for proof of disability, but that is only if the disability is not apparent to you or it's not already previously known. And a proof of documentation for the disability could be just a letter from the medical provider, social worker, or someone with knowledge of the disability that states they have that disability, which requires the accommodation. However, housing providers are not allowed to ask questions about the nature or the extent of the disability, such as how long have you been using the wheelchair, or do you receive SSDI, or are you able to use the stairs on your own? That's a little invasive. All right, so can a housing provider deny a reasonable request? They can, but only under certain circumstances. It has to create, again, as we've talked about before, undue financial and administrative burden, such as asking for a rent reduction that causes the housing provider to cover your portion of the rent. Or if it fundamentally changes the type of service that they provide in housing, such as asking the housing provider to pick up medication or your dry cleaning. That's not a service that they already provide. And 3, the request must be related to the disability. So that would be, an example would be requesting to widen the door frames for anxiety. If it's not directly related to the anxiety, it would not be a reasonable request. And again, if you do get any denials or have any pushback about accommodations or modifications, make sure you're reaching out to me so that I can help you with that process. So some insufficient reasons why a housing provider may deny a reasonable request is because it looks bad, or everybody will want the same accommodation, or that it's not fair to the other tenants, or that the cost is costing them too much, even if it is a reasonable cost. Those are not sufficient enough to deny a request. So can you be charged an extra fee when requesting accommodations and modifications? So let's start off with accommodations. You should never be charged for anything. It's covered under the Fair Housing Act when it comes to reasonable accommodations. Some examples could include not charging assistance animals fees or deposits. This includes also insurance companies that try to deny you for that reason or say there's an extra charge. You should also not be charged a fee for breaking a lease due to a disability. You should not be charged a fee for changing to another unit related to a disability. Let's say that you have a stroke, you're living on the second floor, and now you can no longer climb stairs like you used to, and there's a vacant unit on the first floor. If you request an accommodation, moving yourself to the bottom floor, you should not be charged any kind of extra fees or administrative fees to swap apartments, again, as long as it's available. When it comes to reasonable modifications, you may have to pay out of pocket for those modifications, but it depends. If the building receives federal financial assistance, such as like Section 504, or if it's public housing, something like that, it should be covered and they should be making those modifications for you. I also do want to point out if you do live in a federally funded building, and you apply for a unit that's ADA, you should get what's called the leapfrog, and you should be put at the head of it. So if an ADA apartment comes available, you should get that first. And then the other reason you may not have to pay for a reasonable modification is if the building was built for first occupancy after March 21st, 1991, and it's covered under the new construction requirements, and we'll go over what those are in a little bit. Do you guys have any questions so far? Are they?
But they said, don't bother clean it up. And my friend that also moved next door to me, he was offered to question.
Okay.
I was.
All right, that's something you and me can talk about. Yeah. Gotcha. Yeah, that's something you and me can talk about after.
Place. I would have taken it up.
Yeah, you should have been at least given that choice. Yeah. Okay, yeah, you and me can talk about that after. I have my cards up here and some more information. I'd love to help you out, at least try to get some insight on that, okay? All right, so pop quiz time, since we've learned so much information so far. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna have a situation, and then I will have a good example of what a reasonable request would look like in a not sufficient reason or reasonable request. So the first one is Jane suffers from a severe and traumatic brain injury while she was in the military. The injury prevents her from reading and comprehending written words. What do you think we should include in this? And people online, you're more than welcome to chime in as well. Yeah, so you're on the right track. Yeah. Yeah, so that's exactly what we're going to ask for is we're going to say in the request that Jane is somebody who has a disability, which requires her to be notified over the phone or in person of important messages. If they are unable to get a hold of her, they should, as soon as possible, contact somebody on her emergency list to notify them, and they will notify Jane. What we don't want to do is state what her disability is or go into too many details. And as you'll see here, it also doesn't say exactly what their reasonable request is. All right, going on to number 2. So the situation is Steve has an anxiety disorder and needs a reasonable modification to add a lock to the door in order to equally enjoy the unit. So again, here we're going to say Steve, or what we're going to try to avoid is going into those details again. It does say that he needs an extra lock for security, but that's too much information for the housing provider. We want to be straight and simple, saying that Steve has a disability, which makes it necessary for an additional lock to be installed in order for him to equally enjoy the apartment. Again, the disability, what is the need and how does it relate to enjoying the apartment? What we do want to keep in mind if we're adding extra locks or changing any locks is we want to make sure we stick to New York State law and we are providing the landlord or housing provider with a copy of that key. All right, last scenario. Blake lives with diabetes and requires a service dog to help notify him when his blood sugar runs too low. And his service dog also helps retrieve objects as needed. We haven't learned quite about the specifics of service dogs yet, which we'll go into next. But again, we want to say this is exactly what you want to request. Blake has a disability, which requires him to have a service animal. That's the first part. For service animal, you want to clarify that the dog has been trained to help him do a task and that it directly relates to the disability, which allows him to equally use and enjoy the housing unit. We don't want to get into, again, the blood sugar or having any other medical details. So if we stick to those rules of just stating simply they have a disability and what that need is to fully enjoy their home, they should be able to get that accommodation waived, again, as long as it's reasonable. All right, so again, a little more pop quiz. Are these reasonable accommodations? A landlord allows tenant to transfer to a first floor unit that is more accessible. What do you guys think? Thumbs up or thumbs down? Awesome. How about supplying a lease application in large print? Thumbs up or thumbs down? Okay. Providing an ASL interpreter for a tenant association meeting. Do you think they should have to do that? Yes. Same thing if the housing provider was doing like a welcome party or something like that. They should as well do the interpreter. Making exceptions to residency requirements to allow a home health aide to move into the apartment. Yes, I think we talked about that as well. Adjusting the rent payment schedule for a person receiving disability checks later in the month. Yes. And allowing extra time to clean up an apartment due to hoarding. We should also be allowing them to have that extra time as well. Again, it relates to self-care. As long as it's related to a disability, we should be able to provide that. All right, and then are these reasonable modifications? Building a ramp to cover steps at the entrance to a common area. Do we think that's a reasonable modification? Awesome. And who do we think should pay for this modification? It should be the tenant, again, depending on what type of housing they're living in. And who do we think should maintain the ramp after it's installed? Should it be the tenant or the housing provider? Yes, yep, the landlord, the housing provider should maintain it after it's installed. Yep, as long as it's not the federally funded building, or it's not the building covered under 1991. Mhm. All right. And other reasonable modifications could include lowering kitchen cabinets, installing grab bars in the bathroom, as you talked about, widening entryways into a bathroom, providing a flashing doorbell, weatherproofing to lower secondhand insulation for somebody with asthma, or installing power assisted doors. Great job, guys. All right, so going on to the assistants and service animals that we have been briefly talking about. So when it comes to assistance animals, they are covered under the Fair Housing Act, and they're defined as an animal that works or provides assistance or performs a task for the benefit of a person with a disability. An assistance animal is not a pet. So an example of an assistance animal could be a cat, a dog, rabbit, hamster, fish, bird, um, and they could be used as guiding an individual who is blind or has low vision, providing therapeutic support with respect to an individual's mental disability affecting their major daily activities, or a veteran returning from combat relying on the use of an assistance animal for that therapeutic support due to PTSD. What the landlord needs for an accommodation request for this is a request by the person with the disability or on their behalf that states the disability related need for the animal, if again it's not already apparent. However, the landlord may not approve the request if it would cause an undue financial burden or change the nature of the housing provider's operations, or if the animal would pose a direct threat to others or result in physical damages that cannot be, here's the key words, reduced or eliminated. We want to reduce or eliminate those first before we deny a request. All right, and service animals. Service animals are covered under the Americans with Disabilities Act, also known as ADA. And service animals are defined as any dog, specifically a dog, that is trained to do work or perform a task related to a person's disability. And they are not required to be certified or go through any training program. They are not required to wear a vest or have an ID stating that they are a service dog. And again, we want to remember they are not emotional support or comfort dogs because those are not covered under ADA. There's like a broader acceptance of ADA. So the landlord, actually, examples of a service dog, again, the training a dog to sense anxiety attacks or take specific actions to help avoid or lessen the attack. Or a dog trained to receive objects, remind someone to take their meds, or detect the onset of seizures to help them remain safe. In this circumstance, it's very similar. The landlord can ask if the dog is a service animal required for a disability and what work or task the dog has been trained to perform. However, the landlord cannot ask for documentation that the dog is registered, licensed, or certified, and they cannot ask that or require the dog to demonstrate the task or ask about the person's disability. Yeah, go for it. Yes, you're talking about somebody who's a little like they're confronted about whether or not it's a service dog and what they should do in those circumstances. So again, as long as it meets the definition of a service dog under the ADA, people can ask all the questions they want, but you don't have to always answer them. And again, if you're getting pushback, feel free to contact me and I will show up. I'll email, I'll call, whatever you guys need to make sure that everybody's on the same page of what's considered a service dog. Yeah, of course. No, you're good.
natural to people like Brett, you know, and I guess for some reason there's a status way to having service done. So if it's, you can ask that, but how do you know that it's really?
Because they told us. That's all we have to go off of. If they meet those two criteria of the dog is a service animal required for the disability, and that it has a work or has a task that it's performed due to that disability, you can ask for documentation if it's not apparent. Otherwise, you have to take it at face value because we're just trusting that people have this, you know. That's what we should be doing.
Any,
I'm sorry, what was that?
any. Sorry, you gave the place. Can they do, can they do?
Way Drive or something, that little area in that over there in North Austin.
I'm sorry.
I think, great for years, there's some, great. Okay, you're very, thereby, they.
It depends on the laws and why you're being evicted at the point. We also have good cause, so depend on when the eviction was. But again, I can help you with that after. Yeah, the buildings are old around here, but you know, it all's circumstances, so I'd love to talk to you about that.
As you said, it's complicated. They should have, right?
It all depends on the circumstances. Like I said, I'd love to discuss that after. Yeah. Yeah, I can't, like I said in the beginning, I can't provide legal advice, but I'd love to discuss it after. Yeah, it sounds like an unfortunate situation. Yeah, like I said, grab my card and we'll talk after. Love to help you out. All right, moving on to, can restrictions be placed on assistants or service animals? Reasonable restrictions could include local leash laws. Make sure your animals are vaccinated and make sure you're picking up after your animal. Those are just city local laws that should be followed. Excessive restrictions that a housing provider could place, well, they're not, they shouldn't be placing, is prohibiting animals in common areas. If you're allowed to go there, your service or assistance animal should also be going there as well. Forcing animals to leave the property to relieve itself, like making them go across the street, they should not be doing that. They can't restrict any kind of barking from an animal. Dogs are going to make the noise and you have the animal to make sure that you are safe or it's helping your disability in some way. So we can't restrict that as well. Breed, size, or weight restrictions, you see that on a lot of housing advertisements. That doesn't apply if it's a service or assistance animal. There are a few exceptions. As we've seen, it's a common pattern. If the animal is a direct threat, that again cannot be eliminated or reduced. They can impose that, or if the animal causes an undue financial or administrative burden, or fundamentally alters the service that they provide. All right, so we're almost done here. Just a few more things to consider. We're going to go over these briefly. Source of income discrimination as it relates to someone's disability. So a housing provider should accept all sources of lawful income, which could be Social Security, disability insurance, supplemental security. It could be workers' comp. It could be veterans' disability. That should all be accepted as any kind of income that other people receive as well. However, housing providers may ask about income, including where you're getting your income from and the required documents to proof.
I thought,
Mhm.
I didn't allow, I had not, I didn't allow me, if I could, well, but since required.
Oh, but you had the voucher that was that would work for that apartment? See, that's a good example. Yep. And that's why I included the housing vouchers in here as well, because if you get the determination from the housing voucher agency that you can pay for the apartment and they already did the math, credit scores and history are not valid indicators of whether or not you can pay your rent because it's already been determined that HUD is going to pay the 2/3. You're going to pay the other third. That's great. Yeah. Yeah, we want to make sure if we're
Beneficiary for the property. That I know we're gonna use them for it, but she also wants her brother to do that.
Yeah, and again, if you experience any of that, make sure you're calling me so I can help out. Yeah, here's an example of that. So this is actually from a housing provider in the area. They have an advertisement for one of their units, and it says currently not accepting any housing assistance, including Section 8, SSD, SSI. If we see any of this, they actually have a HUD pending case right now because they've done this multiple properties. Their justification is that they assumed people receiving vouchers wouldn't be able to afford their apartments, when in fact it was actually within. Either way, if the price was really high, they should still not be advertising this. So advertising in the housing application process, the screening process, or in any rental requirements or policies, we want to make sure it's equitable and not excluding people. All right, moving on to requesting parking accommodations, which can look like providing reserved or designated parking spaces, waiving any first come, first served policies, waiving fees for parking near the building, providing accessible parking spots, van accessible parking spots, or providing striping, signage, curb cuts, or ramps to access accessible parking spots. And as we talked about the accessible design and construction, that is multifamily 4-unit buildings that are occupied or like constructed to be occupied after March 21st, 1991. These must be accessible. And the 7 qualifications for it to be accessible is it must have an accessible building entrance with an unobstructed route to the entrance, which also includes the parking lot, public streets, and sidewalks. The accessible public and common use areas, usable doors by someone in a wheelchair, accessible route into and through the dwelling unit. The light switches, electrical outlets, and any other environmental controls must be in accessible locations. They must have reinforced walls and bathrooms so that, again, we can do the grab bars in the bathroom as needed, and usable kitchens and bathrooms for people in wheelchairs as well, so they can maneuver and get around as needed. So one last thing that I want to cover is possible issues you may experience while finding an apartment for a home, such as a housing provider telling you where to live because of your disability and not providing you that choice to make. Housing provider denying your application because they refuse to accommodate the request due to your disability. Again, we should be able to live where we want to without putting up those barriers. So we can ask for accommodations, but we shouldn't just be denying people. Housing providers refusing to change your rent due date that accommodates the day you receive your disability-related income. Refusing to provide an interpretation service to go over the lease or show the home. Denying an application for having an assistance animal, stating they do not allow pets or their insurance does not cover pets staying there. And lastly, excuse me, refusing to let someone with seizures use recreational facilities such as gyms. Again, anybody looking for housing, make sure you report any violations that you see, either to me, HUD, New York State, and any housing providers. Please feel free to reach out to me if you have questions. I do want to make sure to help and ensure that everyone is complying with fair housing laws. So where can you get help? And again, get any questions answered. You can file a discrimination complaint. You can get information by emailing me, calling me, or coming in person. Again, my name is Amanda Aarons. I'm the Fair Housing Officer, and here's my information. You can also find complaint forms on the website at albanyny.gov. If you do file a discriminatory claim, it's going to start off with you filing it. I'm going to do an intake with you. And I'm going to do some research to figure out what the claim is about. I'll determine whether or not it's in my jurisdiction to take. If it is, I'll go through the investigation process and try to do conciliation or try to get to the bottom of it to come to a resolution. All right. Thank you so much for listening to my presentation. Here are some other places you can also get help and file discrimination claims. Do you guys have any questions?